Welcome back to Historical Context. Today we continue our Jamestown unit, and today we focus on the second part of our 1619 discussion. And today we talk about the origins of slavery, and we also talk about indentured servitude at Jamestown. And at precisely the same time as the House of Burgesses' first ever session was occurring, and you can go back to last week's episode to get the details of that, in August 1619, a ship was docking in Jamestown. And this Dutch ship carried slaves from the African continent. There were approximately 17 men and 3 women aboard, and these Dutch had been involved in the slave trade with the Spanish in the Caribbean and in Florida for quite some time now. But in this case, they were looking to trade for tobacco. So tobacco and its popularity out of Jamestown had brought the Dutch here with slaves. And so tobacco, while it is seen by historians as the cash crop utilized for slave labor, actually was the first form of currency used to purchase slave labor in Jamestown. And so without the tobacco, it's highly unlikely that the Dutch would have ever been incentivized to come to the colony. But before we get to that trade, we need to understand how labor worked in Jamestown up to this point. The colony found its calling with tobacco, but not nearly the people that were available to work the fields could produce it and harvest. The labor shortage created by the success of tobacco caused people in England to go so far as to abduct and ship people illegally from England to Virginia. So as we think about that for a moment, and we understand from our history classes what the slave trade was, and in a lot of cases the slave trade was the abduction and shipping of Africans to the American continent, and in this case we're talking about the abduction of English people in England being sent over to Jamestown. In October of 1618, a complaint came to the Justice of the Peace in Somerset, England, involving an Owen Evans, who confessed to luring young women to be sent to Virginia and Bermuda. He was fined 10 shillings. Additional co-conspirators of Owen Evans were brought before the court, and that following month they were fined as well. In January of 1619, 100 impoverished children were clothed and sent to America for work, with the costs of their transportation levied as debt for their indentured servitude. The historian who discovered the writing about this referred to it as the equivalent of rescuing American youth from the streets of large cities and securing them homes and employment. This historian, I believe, lived in the 19th century. It was also noted that in 1619 alone, 1,261 persons were sent to Jamestown to increase the population to 2,400. So think about that at the time. At the end of 1619, half of your population is brand new. Of those 1,261 persons, 90 were young women to be made wives, and 100 were boys for apprenticeships. 50 more were there as servants. John Porey, an English politician and writer, wrote about labor and the plantations in 1619. Let's have a look. All our riches for the present do consist in tobacco, wherein one man by his own labor hath in 1 year raised to himself the value of 200 sterling. and another by means of 6 servants hath cleared a crop of 1,000 pounds English. He goes on to say, our principal wealth, I should have said, consists in servants, but they are chargeable to be furnished with arms, apparel, and bedding, and for their transportation and casual, both at sea, and for their first year commonly at land also. But if they escape, they prove very hardy and sound, able men. So the importance there of Pori's second writing is talking about the essentially wealth that indentured servants brought to the colony, but that they also required an amount of maintenance, if you will. So let's, with all of that in mind, go back to this Dutch ship. Later in the month of August, this is after the House of Burgess has dismissed, a trade is completed with the Dutch for the 20 African slaves. John Rolfe is the only individual to record this transaction. These slaves essentially become the first African Americans in the modern-day United States. Initially, these men and women are treated like indentured servants with a debt placed against them that they are required to work off. While historians have suggested that some of these slaves worked their way to freedom, becoming the first freed African Americans in the U.S., a census document from 1624 makes 2 important distinctions. First, the census taker notes 23 Negroes on the census, just 3 more than what arrived 5 years prior. While the mix of 12 men and 11 women were certainly different than the original 17-3 balance, it indicates that there was not a huge demand for slavery in those early years of the trade in Virginia. The second distinction is while these slaves may have been financially treated the same as indentured servants, they were certainly not considered equal. This is shown by their separate category in the census. The number of indentured servants was included in the population of 1,209. Now you may be hearing that population number, 1,209, and thinking, that's a lot smaller than the 2,400 he brought up earlier. There's a story behind that later. In fact, there was no separation of indentured servants in the census other than gender. So it was clear that African Americans, these first African Americans in Jamestown, had a separate distinction from indentured servants. For the indentured servants themselves, most of them were poor and illiterate. Therefore, their stories are essentially never told. There are a few exceptions, however. Richard Freethorn, an indentured servant at Martin's Plantation, and they were significant last week's episode, Martin's Plantation, did write a short letter to his parents in 1623. Let's have a look. A mouthful of bread for a penny loaf must serve for 4 men, which is most pitiful. You would be grieved if you did know as much as I do, when people cry out day and night, oh, that they were in England, without their limbs, and would not care to lose any limb to be in England again, yea, though they beg from door to door. He goes on to say, for we came but 20 for the merchants, and they are half dead, just, and we look every hour when 2 more should go. Yet there came some 4 other men yet to live with us, of which there is but 1 alive, and our lieutenant is dead, and also his father and his brother. So Freethorn's writing hints that indentured servants may have suffered the brunt of scarce resources and illness in Jamestown. For those early slaves, and we don't know how long this goes on for yet, They came over without the ability to write, and they did not know the language. So sadly, their perspective was lost. Next week, a massacre would strike the Jamestown colony. We'll see you next time on Historical Context.